Welcome to this special edition of Great Books, featuring a panel of young students sharing their interest in classic literature.
Welcome to the Great Book Show. Our selection tonight is going to be The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. It was written about 1885, and setting was in London. Dr. Jekyll was a respected doctor and a respected member of the community, and he felt driven to derive a drug that brought out his evil side, called it Mr. Hyde. And the story ends where Mr. Hyde murders somebody, was seen, and he goes back to the lab and kills himself. Simple story, right? So my first question is, what drove Dr. Jekyll along this path? What drove him to develop the drug and then to eventually enjoy having these two personalities? And any ideas?
Well, Mr. Hatfield, I think it might have been, in the beginning, maybe his fundamental goodness and sense of idealism that drove him to create this drug, that he thought that he could make himself more perfect by eliminating his evil nature. But in the end, he wound up destroying himself in the process.
Well, I believe that Dr. Jekyll actually developed the drug in an attempt to separate his good from his evil side, but not to destroy his evil side or to rid himself of his evil side, but in order to, as he said, he spoke of the idea of he had two beings. Each man has two men inside of him. I believe he wished to separate these two and live throughout them vicariously.
I agree with Catherine, and I believe he created it because he wanted to kind of be able to see both sides on an equal level, and also not have to separate himself.
I think it was because he wanted to see what pure evil in a man was really like, because most people are not purely evil. It's not really a thing that most people can come upon. So he wanted to see what being pure evil really brought someone to be.
Can I read something? This is on, we have different copies here. It's on the Henry Jekyll's full statement of the case. And it's in that first paragraph. And he says, indeed, the worst of my faults was a certain impatience, gaiety of disposition, such as has made the happiness of many, but such I found it hard to reconcile with my imperious desire to carry my head high and wear a more commonly grave countenance before the public. So from that, I think he's feeling this tension between his kind of let's have fun side, and then he had to be this staid doctor, member of the community. And I thought that kind of drove him toward that.
Yes, I found that evidence as well, because it said that he was born into a inheritance, that he was supposed to be a respectable, decent public figure in order to satisfy the needs of his family. But I agree with you, because I feel like that forced his darker or more indecent side into the shadows and sort of developed as two separate personalities and incorporated into one man. So I felt that almost he was suffering from almost bipolar disorder or split personalities, and ultimately his motivation to develop the drug came from that.
I agree. I wasn't really understanding that he was also Mr. Hyde. It just made it, it kind of made it seem like he had multiple personality disorder to me. So I was kind of confused, and I read again, and it said that he was also Mr. Hyde, so it kind of seemed like he had a multiple personality disorder that kind of went a little too far.
Well, don't we all have two sides? Don't we all have this fun, kick off the shoes and dance through the meadow sort of thing, and versus the have to appear, this very proper person before, school teachers and parents and all that? And isn't that common to everybody?
Yes, but I believe that there are two sides to every person. There is someone that you act, a person that you act around your friends and your peers, and a person that you act around your like elders and respectable figures. But I don't believe that it's two separate sides. I believe it's a spectrum. Like how you act around like a camp counselor would probably be somewhere in the middle. I believe with Dr. Jekyll, perhaps it was a little more extreme than the everyday normal person, and that one side, Dr. Jekyll wasn't inherently pure, and Dr. Hyde wasn't inherently evil. I believe it was a mixture of sorts.
I disagree with that, truthfully. I think it was more of him trying to free himself from the constraints of having to feel like he had to be, like, to simmer down his normal self and his happy self and excited self to be this distinguished figure. I feel like it's not necessarily him as a person having multiple personalities, it's more him having multiple sides and wanting to see both of them in an equal light, and him thinking, well, I want to try this out because I don't feel like my dark side has seen the world enough, and I want to see what would happen if it did.
Kind of I'm going to read something that agrees with that. He says, I felt younger, lighter, happier in body. Within, I was conscious of a heady recklessness, a current of disordered sensual images running like a mill race in my fancy, a solution of the bonds of obligation, an unknown but not innocent freedom of the soul. So he was really enjoying that side of his personality, right?
I think that, as you put it, about having to always appear serious and dignified, that obviously created a lot of pressure on him. And maybe he felt just driven to the point that he felt he needed to liberate his darker side because he felt maybe he could enjoy it more, and that this side could prove maybe part of his liberation from having to be so constrained.
I agree, because as Mr. Hyde, he could do many things that, Dr. Jekyll could easily get caught for, because everybody knows who he is. But Mr. Hyde, even though he is easily recognizable, it's easier for him to get away with things because then he can just become Dr. Jekyll again. So it's kind of a way for him to let out stress and feeling.
Yeah, another thing to go along with that is that it often said that Dr. Jekyll did not feel guilty or accountable for the things that Mr. Hyde did. So perhaps before he had created the drug, he always felt an inner suppression of his darker side because there were consequences, and he had the moral conscious that he knew that they were wrong. But however, when he was Mr. Hyde, he didn't feel it was himself committing the actions.
Yeah.
I feel like you could say that about anyone, though. You could say that anyone at all moments is suppressing their darker evil side because you are doing what's considered normal in society and acceptable, whereas you could go around hurting people and killing people and being terribly mean to people. We don't, because we feel empathy and we know it's not socially acceptable. It's not necessarily just Dr. Jekyll. It's everyone, in a sense, is kind of doing the same. It's more of I feel it's more of a representation of everyone in a way.
Yes, I wasn't trying to say that it's inherently just Dr. Jekyll. I was implying in the circumstances of this novel. But yes, I do believe that there is great symbolization in this novel of the relationship between Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde that is relatable to everyone's everyday lives. I believe that is one of the main themes of the novel.
I agree with that, because when you get that kind of thought, this person, they make me upset, and then you push away that thought and you're like, no, I don't want to do this, I'm a human being. So it's kind of like showing that everyone feels that way, but not everyone pushes it back.
This kind of reminds me of one of Sigmund Freud's concepts about how society and parts of the human brain exist to keep down your darker, more savage desires, but that some people simply cannot hold it in check.
Early on, when he's on this statement of when Jekyll's explaining himself, that he says that his evil side's very human, and it's common to all humanity. And then later on, when it seems to take hold of him more, he's saying that evil side is not human. Do you think Stevenson is trying to say that that side held in check is okay. It's only when you let it out of check and then when murder happens and all the bad things in life.
Yes, this is very much that it is all right to be human and have bad characteristics, just once you let them predominate your personality, they become out of control. I think this is definitely a statement about the dual nature of humans' personalities, how there tend to be a bad side and a good side to all people.
Do you think bad is a good word to use?
I don't believe so. There are bad characteristics or violent characteristics of these evil tendencies like violence and harming others, but some of it is just human curiosity. Most of it, I believe, is just human nature. It's part of the human existence to wonder about other things that aren't socially acceptable or considered impure. So this bad side isn't inherently evil. Sometimes it's just not all pure. It's not everything is black and white. There are areas of gray and there are areas that fall somewhere in between.
And when he starts off, he's I think when I read earlier, he's saying it's the fun side too. I mean, it's the freedom and the fun and the, yeah. So
I feel like that also comes with a time period though, because nowadays we don't necessarily think of the happier party side of ourselves as the impure side of ourselves. I believe that's more a sign of his time period and showing that, because at that time, religion was such a big thing, it was not as much allowed to go out and do these sorts of things. And for us, it's more of a positive thing, and back then it was more of a negative thing.
Yeah. Anybody else?
I think he's saying that, like you touched on, that these more, as you put it, impure characteristics are not altogether bad when they're combined with the rest of your personality, but they can become very dangerous if they're allowed to predominate, if you act on them all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't realize it until you said that, but I very much agree with that idea that these characteristics that are considered bad aren't truly evil aren't truly evil because you combine them with other concepts of your personality. Because if someone is, for example, like easily excited or easily worked up, like they might, not combined with other personalities, they might do something violent or disruptive, but combined with like hard work and morals, that might fuel them to like start a charity or do something good with those characteristics.
I agree, because sometimes if you have maybe the wrong influences on you, then you can take all that hard work and belief and motive and you could use it to something bad. But if you have the right influences and the right motives, then you could use it for something good, like you said, like starting a charity and being kind.
Do you think Stevenson, looking at what I'm going to call the good side, does he really think it's good, or does he kind of get into maybe it's a little boring, maybe it's a little restricted? Is it? He's not saying stay with Dr. Jekyll's state of mind is kind of what we should be aiming for.
Sorry. I don't feel he thinks it's boring, but I feel he thinks you need to have a good balance between the dark and the light side of yourself, no matter what you're doing or who you are. You can't all be good and all be evil. There's differences in everyone.
I feel like Stevenson showed a contrast between characters like Utterson and Dr. Jekyll's, because Utterson is very inherently good. He is sort of boring, and he doesn't believe in the supernatural as much as Dr. Jekyll would. And so I don't know, that instance might be seen as good becoming boring, but he also shows that evil, or the bad side, can become overpowering. So I believe that there has to be some equal balance between the two in order to live fully.
I think that there's very much a statement of you cannot have one without the other, that you cannot separate your two sides from one another, and it is destructive if you do. And that you must learn to accept your negative characteristics to be able to accept yourself. And what really makes a difference is what you act on.
I agree because it literally did destroy him when he did separate his good and his, I guess, bad side.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on which one you act with, it can change a lot because the way he would like act as Mr. Hyde, it would make Dr. Jekyll seem of more of a boring, uninteresting life. Because he's been doing many things as Mr. Hyde, but then when he's Dr. Jekyll, he's just sitting, he is just doing work. So I think they're trying to say that even though like one side can be different than the other, it can like, even though one side is different than the other, it doesn't mean that one side is purely better than the other.
Yeah. And either side could be bad. I mean, either side could, if you just emphasize one side, you're...
Anything can be poisonous in a large enough or small enough or different amount.
Yeah.
I agree with Shannon. I think that maybe what he's saying is not that being good is boring. I'm just saying I think he leaves that it can be a lot of pressure, and that under a lot of pressure, the other extreme obviously being totally negative and dangerous, will seem tempting and, like, to be honest, fun. But once you go to that other extreme, it will, in some ways, probably be worse than the other, than where you were.
Why, I was trying to think of how many movies have been TV shows been made on Jekyll and Hyde or this theme. And through the ages, this has been very predominant in different forms. Why do you think that's so? Why is it so popular and people just go back to it again and again?
I think it's so popular because the way it does represent people's good and bad side, that it shows, like you said earlier, that you cannot have one without the other. So it kind of shows a good moral and a good takeaway.
Yeah, no one is born without curiosity, and no one has ever existed without having at least one negative thought. Like, if you're in an argument with someone, no one has ever gone with conflict and not thought something along the lines of, like, what if I just acted out against them? It's a continuous theme throughout human existence because it comes with being a person, it comes with the human experience, and this book just very well captures that ideal, and it is shown throughout human nature.
It hits close to home, maybe not to the extent that we're all philanthropic, desperate scientists seeking to create an induced state of schizophrenia, but I think we can all understand maybe the morbid curiosity of what's it like to be murderous or violent, and we all, to some extent, will feel constrained maybe by the restrictions society will put on us, and we feel the pressure, and so maybe not what Jekyll does, maybe we can understand the way he feels and his sense of desperation.
The reason the book has lasted for so long, I think, is because it's an interesting study on human nature and how we act and why we act and the different ways that we act, and it's something that will not change no matter how many years has gone by. There will always be both good and bad Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in everyone. So,
like what Quentin was saying about like human nature and morbidity and stuff, like, why do you think there are so many crime shows? Why do you think people slow down when there's an accident on the highway? Everyone's curious to see what happened, even though it's not acceptable to admit it.
As you read this, what kind of grabbed you, or something, either a question that came up, or you go, aha, or really had a lot of energy for you? Anything in particular?
The first thing that struck me was the mood of the book. Some of the words he used to describe, like in the story of the door, the first chapter, some of the words he just used to describe it, he did an excellent job of setting the tone, which really made me want to read more. what also grabbed me was I kept thinking, what would happen if I actually did this to myself? Not that I want to, but what would my version of Mr. Hyde be like?
I was really fascinated by the inhuman way that they kind of described Mr. Hyde throughout the novel, and how that everyone who met him absolutely despised him, no matter what way they, like, no matter how little they saw him or how much they saw him, everyone absolutely hated him. And I found it interesting because it's almost showing how inherently evil that side of him is, because you're not generally going to see someone on the street and be like, oh, I absolutely hate you. You know, it's showing how much of a negative aura he gives off and how negative he affects people. And I found that fascinating, because if you think there's a Mr. Hyde in everyone, there's a side of everyone that can immediately turn other people off just by being there.
I agree with you, because when I was reading it, I also found I really liked the way that they described him, saying that everyone hated him no matter, even if they saw what he did, like in the beginning when he ran over the girl, just seeing him on the street at all just gave you a horrible feeling. But then they also do say later it's because of that he was so evil that he had the look of almost pure evil.
Yeah, there's a quote that said, "I never saw a man I so disliked, and yet I scarce know why." These people knew that he was ugly, and they knew that he was like, he displeased them, but they never knew why. And it's probably what I think it was that this vibe he gave off, for less of a term, the evil that he radiated affected people and affected their opinion of him. And I feel like that is very true today. If you are a hateful person, people can tell, even from just the way that you carry yourself.
Mr. Utterson said that no one who saw Hyde could describe what he was like, and that no two people who have seen him will give the same description. I kind of wonder if that's a statement that no two people's negative side will be carbon copies of one another, and that you will see different aspects of the same person.
I see well, go ahead.
Oh, I agree with that, because like Quentin said earlier, he would want to know what his Mr. Hyde would be like, even though he would never do it. I'm sure everyone's Mr. Hyde would be completely different than another's. They wouldn't all just be the exact same. Everyone has their own mind, and everyone has their own thoughts of what they would do.
I kind of see three different, not just two different mental states, because one of them is the very restricted, staid Dr. Jekyll. The other is the evil Mr. Hyde. But kind of when he first was opening up to that side of him, was this carefree, fun, kind of happy sort of person. Do you think if there's a drug that could emphasize that part of people, that it would be worthwhile, or the same story would come out in a different way?
I feel like a very similar story would come out of it.
Yeah.
Perhaps not in a way where it harm others, like the murder and the tramplement of the young girl, but anything in large doses can be harmful. Moderation is key. I feel like that rule is applicable to all aspects of life. And if there was a drug that took out the carefree, fun side of people, I feel like you need that responsibility in your life. You would probably make some life choices that would not be beneficial to your overall well-being.
Even if I feel like this was created or is created in some way, I feel like it's the sort of thing where you could never go back to being the same person ever again. It's almost damaging your normal, natural self in a way, because you have now seen this side of yourself that is different from any other side of yourself. It's completely and absolutely one way, which is not necessarily what most people are. That's not what anyone is. And so I feel like you could never go back to being the same way ever again, and it would inherently damage you in some way forever.
I think that what you're talking about with the happy drug, that's what she said, that you could never go back. And I think the person who took the drug would be almost addicted to it in a way, because anytime they went back to normal, it would feel like they were gloomy. and that responsibility would always feel like the weight of the world, even when it wouldn't naturally, because they would have seen what it was like to always feel like you're on cloud nine or always partying. And then I think that could be dangerous to someone because they wouldn't really know when to stop or when the fun should end or when to be responsible.
I think the story would be quite similar because separating your happy, like normal self from your bad side, it would intentionally destroy you no matter who you are, because separating those two things could easily damage you.
Okay. I was thinking, as you were talking, the 50s, which you guys weren't around, was this staid kind of, some people say boring, and then the 60s happened, which was, dancing in the street sort of thing. And it was the same thing with the trying to find a mix between the two. So any last word, just a few minutes left, any last thoughts?
One thought that I found intriguing by the book was, does Stevenson think that good is weak and evil is strong? And I personally, even though Hyde was stronger and younger than Jekyll was, I think that good is, Jekyll invented Hyde, Jekyll created Hyde, so evil might be stronger than good is when allowed by good. So good has to give evil the tools to become stronger and more powerful and a dark force. So I feel like that's very applicable to life because evil cannot become strong unless good people give evil the tools to become such.
Great.
There it is. I think about that
We have about
it
30
needs-
seconds, so
that good needs to have strong will to survive, and that there's actually Winston Churchill something about a quote that said like the strength of the wicked was increased by the weakness of the virtuous, which I think sums up what you're talking about.
great. Did you enjoy it, reading it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's a lot there, isn't there?
Yeah.
So
Yes.
we
So
could talk
short
for
book,
another
full of thought.
hour, and unfortunately we can't. So I thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been fun. It's
Yeah.
been a
Been a
lot of fun.
pleasure.
So
Thank you.
It was great.
Thank you guys.
yeah.